Kia ora koutou, e nui ngā mihi ki koutou. It's with great pleasure that I accept this wonderful award, and thank you to the Royal Society. I want to acknowledge straight off those who have been so influential in my research journey. But I want to immediately come to a question that I was asked in my Chief Science Advisor's role. It was, what's the value proposition of educational sciences, which threw me back for a wee while. I thought a lot about the cost-benefit analysis, and I can answer that question in part, but in this presentation I just want to talk a little bit about what I've come to learn about the impact of educational sciences. And so it's a rather selective history of my research. I will talk a little bit about each of those as we make our way through the slides. I started with some PhD study work which was on manipulating self-regulation and oral reading. We wanted to show that if you use the timing of feedback, you could turn self-regulation on and off in early reading as children were learning to read. And we could show and demonstrate impacts on accuracy and fluency and word learning. But the impact of that was after the quasi-experimental studies. It was when we designed tutorial models which could be repurposed for different contexts, particularly whānau and family tutoring at home, and peer tutoring, and there are a couple of examples there. We designed something called Pause, Prompt and Praise, and then colleagues at Potama Pounamu Research Centre, Medi Berryman and Ted Glynn, designed a similar tutoring set of procedures for Māori medium, Tare Tautoko and Tawawhi. So I learned a lot about impact at the level of access to resources and, if you like, dissemination of information and simple packages. But I broadened after that to some work that looked at rather seemingly simple sorts of reading exercises, activities that early childhood teachers, whānau, first year teachers would do, and that is read a book to a child. And after a while, figured out that this is much more than a cognitive activity. If you look at different communities, different cultural groups, you find that it's a deeply social and cultural activity. In fact, we wanted to frame this as practices. And by framing the idea of reading books to children as a set of practices, we could understand cultural norms and values, and we could also understand the relationship between what whānau and early childhood teachers might be doing before school and the relationship between those styles of reading, storybooks, to what happens at school. And some styles enable kids to make the transition to school better than others, described as a narrative style. And in addition to that, having used the concept of practices that are socially and culturally driven, if you like, we realized that rather than try and impose types of reading books in communities and whānau, we needed to intervene in ways that were additive, that added to the existing cultural practices and didn't undermine them. For example, in some communities, recitation is a really important practice in storybook reading, and that led to some further studies around assessments, because if you understand reading and learning to read at school in terms of practices, you come to realize that it's much more than a set of instructional techniques. It's what technically we call a form of intersubjectivity when it works well. That is, the teacher needs to understand the child needs to understand the teacher, and what the rules are, if you like, intention and goals of the activity might be. However, there's a problem. About 15 years ago, I realized that designing procedures, developing tutorial models, even developing concepts of practices that could be used in teacher ed or in professional development did not solve something that was a real problem at scale. That is, if you impose programs, we've learnt this over and over, both in education and in health, if you impose programs, typically over time there is limited sustainability and limiting effectiveness. And that we needed to figure out how on earth we could develop programs that were usable and sustainable at scale rather than limited, as I say, in terms of sustainability. Why is this a problem? It's because unlike, can you give me that again? 5 minutes. Unlike it's not like rocket science. It's a different sort of set of phenomena because we're dealing with complex, open and dynamic systems. So we figured out that you need to change the approach if you're going to generate useful research information that's able to be used in schools over time. We changed the research model from one of designing programs, if you like, that were then able to be accessed by schools into a partnership model of working with schools in which you solved local problems using local contextualized evidence. Really importantly, by identifying the strengths and innovation that already existed in the system and building on those rather than just identifying the weaknesses. Really importantly to us, we could show that this is not just applied problem solving, it also could generate new knowledge. We were using the old idea, if you like, of positive deviance to identify through variability what might work at scale. This learning schools model addresses a really interesting conundrum in a national system. That is the conundrum of variability being both positive and negative. The negative part of it is that we're far too variable in our system, particularly in terms of our equity outcomes. But by the same token, if we're too consistent, we reduce, as Oscar Wilde said, imagination. I would call it innovation, if you like. We can replicate this way of working with schools. We've done it on many occasions over school clusters, different regions, innovations at scale, and indeed across countries. There are other ways to reduce variability in the system. I've already referenced some, that is to increase teacher capability by providing new concepts that come out of the research. One example here is that I've learned that instruction carries risk. All instruction carries risk. And one of the important parts of pedagogical content knowledge, teachers knowing about how to teach well, is knowing about the risks associated with teaching. For example, opportunity cost. And we need to understand complexities, which is a point I made earlier on. Interestingly, and I want to give a shout out to the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment for some research funding for social science that enabled us to look at the ways in which a digital innovation in a set of schools was impacting self-regulation, and through the self-regulation, particularly inhibitory control, and through the social skills that were being developed in this particular context, could impact writing achievement. But you need very complex models in order to understand this. Last 2-3 slides, there is an urgent need at the moment so I'm looking forward, if you like, to new research and impact. A really urgent need at the moment to be able to understand better the opportunities and risks in the digital environments that our children are being reared in. And I look at these opportunities and costs in terms of two different sets of skills. Citizenship skills, which are to do with being able to reason effectively, being able to engage in argumentation, in activities with others that involve empathy and perspective taking, and on the other hand, something that is sometimes called critical literacy or media and information literacy, which is enabling our students to learn to determine what is believable, what is accurate, and what is trustworthy. And in our research lab, we've got prototype digital games to try and build these sorts of skills. Last comment. What I learned about impact, I've already mentioned, that is, you've got to look to the strengths and the innovations in a system, because if you don't do that and you impose programs, you're going to undermine, if not ignore, and the result of that is going to be limited effectiveness and lack of sustainability. And I'm sorry to finish with a somewhat negative comment, which is I'm really worried at the moment about some of the policies in education undermining the strengths in our system. Kia ora. Ngā mihi nui. Thank you.
Questions?
I love it that you've got questions. It's brilliant.
You mentioned you were developing resources for teachers, the gem resources. Was there somewhere we could find those resources if we wanted to write them?
Sure. Can I give you a link after this talk? I'm really excited by these actually, but yeah, I've got students in China at the moment developing what we see as an argumentation platform, which is a platform in which students can develop what I called argumentation or collaborative reasoning. Our prototypes were pretty local actually. Taylor Swift, for example, drove Hummers onto the beach, Bethel's Beach in Auckland, and we set up this provocation, argument about whether or not that was defensible, whether she dissed the beach, and what you can do if you get the teaching right is to build ways of arguing which acknowledge the other person's position as well as your own. Thanks, good question.
So I have one. You started off talking about literacy in children and reading stories to children, that sort of thing. How well does what you're describing translate to, say, secondary or tertiary education? And how well does it translate beyond literacy into, say, physics?
That's a difficult question. I'll attempt to answer that question. I've got 4 minutes. Well, give me 3 and I'll think about it, and then no. My answer to that is one part of the answer to that is that the reason we designed what we called the learning schools model is because we wanted to approach schools, and we've done this with secondary schools, in which we said we don't have the answers. We might have the answers if we work together. There's a colleague of mine at the moment who's working on the transition from some schools to our university around STEM. And she didn't say that she had the answers to that question. For example, in their study of physics, how best to teach physics. But together, if you do the analyses of the evidence and look for the strengths and then try to scale those strengths, you'll be better able to do that. That's the first answer to your question. Second answer to your question is we used to talk about all teachers, and this includes secondary teachers, as being teachers of literacy. It's only partially true. What teachers, particularly at secondary, and probably from about year 4, if we could do it, upwards, meaning 9-year-olds, is your teachers of generic literacy skills, but also discipline-specific literacy skills. You think of the literacy required for history studies versus physics, versus maths, versus whatever I've left out, PE and health. These are both generic and specific. Yeah, thank you.
Other questions?
No.
One more?
I don't know why we're looking at you.
Well, maybe I'll ask another one. So, medical school used to be taught in lecture theaters, very kind of rigid, talking at the students. You had a certain amount of material you had to get through. And about the 1990s, people started looking at case-based studies, at case-based education for medicine, where things were done in small groups. That quickly made its way through medical schools all around the world. Can you comment on whether you think the doctors that graduated under those two different regimes were better or worse or complementary? What would be the advantage of case-based study? It's more fun.
Yeah, what I'd like to do is put both together, and I'll tell you why. I used to have this argument with Juliet Gerard, who I worked with as the Prime Minister's Chief Science Advisor. And Juliet uses in her pedagogy as a biochemist a lot of inquiry models. And I said to her that there's in fact a negative correlation between the amount of inquiry going on in schools and achievement in science literacy, according to the OECD, and we have quite a strong negative relationship compared even with other countries. And the reason for that is we can default to a relatively surface level inquiry. I used to ask my grandchildren, 2 of whom are here, when they came home from intermediate school, what did you do today? And they would say, I'm misquoting you, dears. They would say, we did inquiry, like all day. So you can do surfacing, but what you need is both the fundamental knowledge, and some of that's item knowledge, which has to be taught in a very didactic way, and some of it is you need to problem solve and do inquiry and do the pedagogy that you described. And actually, people tend to think of this as binary, but it's not.